People think the hardest part of the post is the standing. The hours, the cold that comes up through the stone and into the bones of your feet, the way an itch you cannot scratch can become the whole world. They are wrong. I stood that gate for 11 years, and I can tell you the standing is the easy part. A man can train his body to stand. The hard part is the not moving when everything in you is screaming to move. The hard part is the holding. My name is Elias Thorne. For 11 years I was a sergeant of the foot guards of Vered, and for the last 6 of those years I held the salt gate of Hallowmere Palace, the old western gate, the one the carts came through, the one the king's grandfather had walked out of on his way to the war he never came back from. It is not the Grand Gate. The Grand Gate faces the river and the city, and that is where the painters set their easels and the visitors point their children. The Salt Gate faces the marshes and the Salt Road, and it is plainer, and the wind off the flats is colder, and on the day I am going to tell you about it had been raining since before dawn. I asked for that gate. No guardsman asks for the Salt Gate. It is the post you are given when you have done something wrong, or the post you take when you are old and your knees are gone and you want somewhere quiet to finish out your years. I was neither of those things. I asked for it the way a man asks for a window that looks a certain direction. I had my reasons and I kept them, the way I kept everything, folded and silent and close. A guardsman learns to look at nothing and see everything. The bearskin sits heavy and hot on your head and narrows the top of the world to a band, and below that band you keep your eyes level, fixed on a middle distance that is no distance at all, and you do not move them, and yet you learn to read the whole forecourt by the edges of your sight. You learn the sound of a particular boot. You learn the weather by the smell before you feel it. You learn the moods of a crowd the way a sailor learns the sea, by 1,000 small things you could not name if you tried. I had learned it all. I could have told you the rank of a man by the way he held his shoulders before he was close enough to show his face. That morning the rain came straight down, no wind in it, a gray rain that turned the cobbles dark in the marsh beyond the wall to a sheet of pewter. The drops ran off the brim of the bearskin and down the back of my neck and under the collar of the red wool tunic, and there is no comfort to be had from that. So I made my peace with it as I had made peace with it 1,000 mornings before. My gloves were white and already gray at the cuffs. My rifle was at my shoulder, the strap biting where it always bit. I stood where I had stood for 6 years, at the right of the Salt Gate's inner arch, and I waited, because waiting was the whole of my trade and I was very good at it. I should tell you what the day was. It was the investiture. Once a year, on the first gray week of autumn, the crown of Vered honored the men it judged to have served it best, soldiers mostly, but in those years more and more the men of the lists, the duelists, the champions whose names the city chanted. The king would come down to the Hall of Hours, and there, before the whole court, he would lay the green ribbon of the realm across a man's shoulders and name him to the kingdom's roll of honor, and the man would be set for life. The carts of provision for the feast had been coming through the Salt Gate since before light, and that was why my post mattered that day at all. The Grand Gate was for the king and the lords. The Salt Gate was for the work. And it was for the champion. I heard him before I saw him, which is the way it always was with that man. There is a particular sound a crowd makes when it is following someone it adores, a kind of warm rolling murmur with laughter bobbing on top of it. And I heard that sound come up the Salt Road through the rain, and I knew the way I knew the weather who was inside it. I had known he would come. I had known it for 6 years. It was, if I am honest with you now, the reason I had asked for the gate. He came on a gray horse with its mane braided, because of course he did, and he was bareheaded in the rain because he wanted men to see that he did not care about the rain, and over his shoulders he wore a half-cloak of black, and at his wrist, looped twice around it the way another man might wear a strap of office, was the whip. You will have heard of the whip even if you never heard his name, because the city made a legend of it. A short black riding whip, plated leather over a steel core, with a little silver cap on the handle. He had carried it since he was a young man, and he carried it everywhere, into the lists and into the ballroom and into the king's own presence, and the city loved it because it loved him, and so it was charming, you see. A small cruelty becomes charming when it belongs to a man everyone has decided to admire. He would flick it at a serving boy who was slow with his wine, and the table would laugh. He would lay it across the flank of a hound that displeased him, and men would say, "Well, that is Calder, that is the champion, he keeps a sharp house." The whip was part of the legend, like the braided mane and the bare head in the rain. It was the thing the painters always put in. Sir Marius Calder, the crown's champion of the lists, the most admired man in the kingdom of Vered, and the man I had come to the Salt Gate to wait for. He rode in under the arch with his little procession behind him, friends and hangers-on, and 2 younger men of the lists who wore his colors and copied his walk. And he swung down from the horse in the forecourt, and handed the reins to a boy without looking at him. And he stood in the rain and stretched and looked up at the gray palace with the smile of a man arriving at a party he is certain has been waiting for him. The crowd had pressed in at the gate behind him, kept back by the rope and by 2 of my fellows, and they were calling his name, and he lifted one hand to them the way I have seen statues of kings lift one hand, and they roared. He had not changed so very much in 20 years. Heavier in the face, gray coming into the dark hair, but the same easy carriage, the same way of holding his chin as though the world were a portrait being painted, and he were taking care to be caught at his best angle. I felt my heart go very slow and very hard in my chest, the way it does before a thing you have prepared for a long time, and I kept my eyes on the middle distance, and I did not move. He noticed me the way a man notices furniture. That is to say, he did not at first. He came across the forecourt toward the inner arch with one of the young men of the lists at his shoulder, talking, and he was going to walk past me as men walk past a post. And then, I have thought about this many times since, why he stopped. I think it was the stillness. There is a kind of man who cannot bear to be near a thing that does not respond to him. A crowd that roars feeds him. A horse that obeys feeds him. Even a hound that flinches feeds him, because the flinch is a kind of answer. But a guardsman gives nothing. We are trained to give nothing. And to a man like Calder, nothing is the one thing he cannot stand, because nothing is the one thing that does not reflect him back to himself. So he stopped. He stopped in front of me in the rain, 3 feet away, and he looked at me the way you look at a painting you suspect of being a forgery, and the young man stopped with him, and the crowd, sensing sport, went quieter to listen. "Look at this one," Calder said, not to me, to the young man, but pitched for the crowd. "Standing in the rain like a tin soldier somebody forgot to bring in," he smiled. "Do they melt, do you think, or only rust?" The young man laughed because he was paid to laugh. A few in the crowd laughed because they were happy, and it was the champion, and anything he said was a gift. I held the middle distance. I gave nothing. A guardsman is not deaf, and he is not a stone, whatever the city likes to say. Behind that unmoving face I can tell you exactly what I was thinking, because I have never forgotten one moment of it. I was thinking, there you are. After 20 years and 6 years of waiting at this gate, there you are, 3 feet from me, and you do not know me at all. And under that I was thinking of a name I had carried so long it had worn a smooth place in me, the way a coin carries smooth in a pocket. I will give you the name now, because the whole of this is built on it, and a man should be named before he is mourned. Jonah Bray. I was thinking, Jonah, here he is. I came, I waited, I am still here. But none of that reached my face. My face was the face of the post. That was the discipline. And the discipline was the thing I had left, and I held it. Calder did not like that I held it. I watched him not like it. He had thrown a small cruelty, and it had gone into the silence and made no echo, and that displeased him the way a flat note displeases a singer. He stepped closer. He lifted the whip, only to gesture with it, you understand, only to point, and he ran the silver-capped handle of it under my chin, along the strap of the bearskin, the way a man tips up the chin of a creature to look at its teeth. "Are you in there?" he said softly, and now it was to me. "Or did they hang an empty coat on a peg and call it a man?" The word he used was hang. I want you to know that he used that word. He could not have known what it did in me, because he did not know me, but he used it, and it went into the smooth, worn place like a key into a lock, and I held myself so still that the rain itself seemed to stand in the air. I did not answer. A guardsman does not answer. But something in my not answering, I will never be sure what, perhaps only that I had still not given him the flinch he wanted, turned the moment over in him from sport to spite. I have seen it happen in men. The cruelty that begins as a joke discovers halfway that it is not getting what it came for, and it does not turn back. It pushes on. It has to. To turn back would be to admit it had failed in front of the crowd, and a man like Calder would rather do almost anything than fail in front of a crowd. He stepped back half a pace, and he looked at me, and he looked at the crowd at the gate, and he smiled the smile that the painters loved, and he raised the whip. The first lash came across my chest, a backhand flick, the plated leather snapping against the brass buttons and the metal ribbons over my heart. It did not cut. It was not meant to cut. It was meant to make a sound, the small wicked crack of it, and to make me move. The crowd made a noise, half a laugh, half an indrawn breath, and the young men of the lists laughed outright, and Calder's eyes were bright with the pleasure of having something to do. I did not move. The blow stung through the wool and was gone. I kept the middle distance. He frowned, and that was the first crack in the day, though no one saw it but me. He had expected the flinch. Every other creature in his life flinched. The serving boys flinched, and the hounds flinched, and the horse flinched. The whole world flinched for Sir Marius Calder, and here was a tin soldier in the rain who would not give him even that. "Stubborn coat," he said, and he was not smiling now, not quite, and he raised the whip again. The second lash came across my face. "I will tell you the truth of it because you have come this far and you deserve the truth and not the brave version." It hurt. It snapped across my cheek below the eye and laid a line of fire there that I would feel for a week, and the shock of it ran down through me like cold water, and every animal part of me, the part that is older than discipline, the part that wants to live and to strike and to not be struck, every part of me surged up at once and said move, and I held it down. I held it down with everything I had ever learned and everything I had ever lost. I held it down for Jonah Bray, who had not been able to hold anything down at the end, who had no discipline left to him on the morning they took him out, because they had taken everything else first. I held it down because I had not waited 6 years at a cold gate to give this man the satisfaction of a brawl he could win. A brawl would make me the mad guardsman who struck the champion, and him the gracious victim, and that is exactly the story he would have wanted told. So I did not move. The blood came warm down my cheek, mixing with the rain, and I let it come, and I kept my eyes on the middle distance, and I gave him nothing. The crowd had gone silent. I want you to understand that the silence was the turn, though none of us knew it yet. A crowd will laugh at the first small cruelty. It will even laugh at the second. But there is a line, and the line is crossed not by the cruelty itself, but by the response, or the lack of one. The flinch makes it a game. The not flinching makes it something else. When a man strikes a thing that will not strike back and will not cry out and will not even turn its head, the watchers stop seeing a game and start seeing what is actually in front of them. A strong man hurting a still one for sport in the rain in front of children. And a crowd that has been laughing and then, all at once, stops, is a more dangerous thing than a crowd that has been angry from the start. The champion did not feel the silence behind him. I felt it. I felt it come down over the forecourt like the rain coming heavier. One of his own young men, the one in his colors, said, "Lo, Marius," and put a hand toward his arm, and Calder shook it off without looking, and that was the second crack that a man of his own party had thought to stop him. I want to step out of the rain for a moment and tell you what was behind the silence in me, because the title of a thing matters less than what is underneath it, and what was underneath me that day was 20 years old. I was a young soldier once, before the gate, before the foot guards, even in a border regiment in the eastern hills when I was barely a man. And in that regiment, in a garrison town whose name does not matter, there were 2 men I will tell you of. One was a young officer, well-born, charming, already famous in a small way for his sword, a man who carried, even then, a short black riding whip he liked to use on the dogs. You have guessed who that was. The other was an ordinary man, a quartermaster's clerk, not young, not handsome, not anybody, a man named Jonah Bray, who kept the regiment's stores and the regiment's books, and kept them honestly, which not every quartermaster's clerk did, and who had once, when I was sick near to dying my first winter with a fever the surgeon had given up on, sat by my cot 4 nights running and spooned broth into me with his own hand and got me through it. For no reason I ever understood except that he was the kind of man who could not watch a boy die in a corner if there was a thing he could do. I owed Jonah Bray my life. That is not a figure of speech. I was 19 and I would have died and he would not let me, and so here I am to tell you of it. There was a killing in that town. A merchant found dead in an alley behind the wine houses, robbed, with a wound that the surgeon said was made by a thin blade driven once, expertly up under the ribs, the kind of stroke a swordsman makes, not a footpad. And there was a great noise about it because the merchant had friends and the garrison needed a man to give them, and the man they gave them was Jonah Bray. I will not take you through all of it. I was 19 and I was not believed, and it does not improve in the telling. I will tell you the bones of it. The young officer with the black whip had quarreled with that merchant the week before, over a debt, a gambling debt, a large one, the kind that ruins a man of his sort if it comes out. I knew about the quarrel because I had carried a message between them, a boy carrying a folded note, and I had seen the officer's face when he read the merchant's answer, and I knew the look of a man who has decided a thing. The night of the killing I saw the officer come back to the garrison late, by the postern in a dark cloak, and go quietly to the well in the yard and wash his hands a long time in the dark. And I saw in the moonlight that he had not his whip with him, the whip he never went without, and that troubled me, and I was a boy and I said nothing. The whip was found in the alley, dropped, I suppose, in the dark in his haste, a short black riding whip with a silver cap on the handle, and it should have hanged him. But a black riding whip is a common enough thing for a gentleman to own, and the officer swore his had been stolen from his quarters a fortnight before, and a witness was found paid, I have no doubt, but found to swear he had seen Jonah Bray near the alley that night, and there was a small debt the merchant had been pressing Bray for, a real one, a few crowns, and so there was a story, and the story was easier than the truth. Because the truth ruined a well-born man with a great future, and the story only ended a quartermaster's clerk who was nobody at all. They condemned him. They hanged him on a cold, gray morning in the garrison yard, and I stood in the rank and watched the man who had saved my life climb the steps with his hands tied, and he was not brave, and I do not blame him, because there is no bravery in it. There is only a man being killed for a thing he did not do, while the man who did it stands at the back of the crowd with his chin at its best angle, washed and clean, in his place of honor, because he is the regiment's pride and Jonah Bray is its rubbish. But before they took him, Bray was let to write a letter, as condemned men were let to do, to settle their souls. He had no family. He gave the letter to the garrison chaplain to send on to no one in particular, a man's last words to the air. And the chaplain, who was old and tired and did not much care, gave it instead for a copper or two, and because I begged him to me, to the boy Bray had nursed, the only one who came to ask after him. In that letter, in his own plain hand, Jonah Bray set down what he knew, the quarrel, the debt, the whip, the officer's name. He set it down not in hope, for he had no hope, but because a man wants the truth to exist somewhere even if it can do him no good. He wrote it for no one, and then he hanged. I was 19 and I took that letter, and I knew that if I showed it I would be a boy soldier accusing the regiment's golden son, and I would be broken or worse, and the letter would be burned and Bray would be hanged twice, and I was afraid, and I did nothing. I have had 20 years to be ashamed of that, and I have used every one of them. I kept the letter, I carried it. Through the border years and the wars after, through the wound that ended my soldiering in the field, through my coming, older and slower, into the foot guards because a man who can no longer march can still stand. I carried it folded in oilcloth against my breast, under the red wool over my heart all those years. And I watched, the way a guardsman watches, the rise of Sir Marius Calder. I watched the border officer become a captain and then leave the army for the lists, where a man with a sword and no conscience can make a brilliant career. I watched the city take him up. I watched him become the champion, and I watched the whip, a new one of course, the old one had hanged a man, become a charming legend. And I learned that once a year the champions of Vered came through the salt gate of Hallowmere to be honored by the king. So I asked for the salt gate, and I stood at it 6 years, and I waited because I had given Jonah Bray nothing the first time, when it might have saved him, and I was not going to give him nothing again. The first time I had been a frightened boy with the truth in his hand and no place to put it where it would be heard. But there is a place where the truth is heard in the kingdom of Vered. There is one day in the year when the king himself comes down, and the whole court stands assembled, and the champion of the lists kneels in the hall of hours to be named to the roll of honor. And on that day, the king is bound by his own old law to hear any sworn man of the guard who steps forward and asks, on his honor, to be heard, before any name is added to the roll. It is an old law, half forgotten, from a time when kings needed their soldiers more than their courtiers. No one had invoked it in a generation. I had read it in the regimental library of an evening, and I had folded it away with the letter, and I had waited for the day the law and the man and I would all be in the same place at the same time. That day was the day of the rain, and the man stood 3 feet from me with my blood on his whip, and he did not know me, and the king was within, and the hall of hours was waiting to make him, at last, untouchable forever. You understand now why I did not move. Calder, getting nothing, was working himself into the spite that men work themselves into when they have begun a cruelty in public and cannot make it pay. He struck me a 3rd time across the shoulder, this time hard, the steel core of the whip behind the leather, and a woman in the crowd cried out, not a cry of sport but a cry of enough. And another voice took it up, and another. The crowd was turning. The young men of his party had stopped laughing entirely. One of my own fellows, Corliss, 2 posts down, had half broken his stance and stopped himself, his face a study in the same fight I was fighting, and I caught his eye for a half instant, the smallest flick, the kind of thing only 2 guardsmen would ever read, and I held him with it, hold, and he held. Calder heard the crowd at last. He heard enough come at him out of the rain from a dozen throats, and it confused him because the crowd was his. The crowd was always his, and he turned to it with the painter's smile ready to win it back, and he found it not smiling. He found a wall of wet, silent, hardening faces, and behind them the rope, and behind the rope the marsh going gray to the horizon. And for the first time in 20 years, I think, Sir Marius Calder felt the ground move under him. He covered it the way such men do. He laughed, a short laugh, and he made a show of it, holding up the whip and looking at it as though it had acted on its own. "A jest," he said to the crowd. "Only a jest. The fellow doesn't mind. Do you, soldier? 10 soldiers don't mind." And he turned back to me and looked into my face, my bleeding face that had not moved, looking for the permission of a flinch, the small lie that would let him off, the answer that would make it a jest after all. I gave him nothing. I looked through him at the middle distance, the way I had looked through 10,000 men, and the blood ran down my jaw and dripped from my chin onto the brass of my buttons, and I stood. And the silence held, and it was not his silence, and he knew it. A trumpet sounded inside the gate, the call that the investiture was made ready, that the champions were to come into the hall of hours. It cut through the rain, 3 notes, and broke the moment. Calder turned from me, glad to turn, and gathered his party with a gesture, and went under the inner arch into the palace with his chin up and his back stiff, and the whip looped at his wrist, and the crowd watched him go and did not cheer. It was then, only then, that I moved. For the first time in 3 hours I broke my stance at the salt gate. I am told that several of the crowd gasped, because they had decided I was furniture, and furniture had stepped down off its plinth. Corliss looked at me with open alarm. I brought my rifle to my side and I turned, and I walked under the inner arch after the champion into the palace, toward the Hall of Hours. A guardsman does not leave his post. To leave the post is the one unforgivable thing. It is the whole of the trade broken in a single step. I had stood 11 years and never broken it. I broke it that day, and I broke it on purpose, because there is a thing higher than the post, and the post exists to serve it, and that thing is honor, and honor that day was walking ahead of me up the corridor with a silver-capped whip at its wrist, and I had waited 20 years and I was not going to be too disciplined to do the one undisciplined thing that mattered. The corridors of Hallowmere are long and hung with the colors of old regiments, and my boots on the stone were the only sound, and ahead of me I could hear the murmur of the assembled court growing as I came toward the great doors of the Hall of Hours. 2 guardsmen stood at those doors, and they knew me, and they saw my face, the blood, the broken stance, a sergeant of the Saltgate walking into the investiture with his rifle in his hand, and one of them, young Aldrich, started forward to stop me, and the other, older, Sergeant Vell, who had been a soldier in the Eastern Hills himself long ago, looked at my face a moment longer and put his hand on Aldrich's chest and held him back, and said only very low, "On your honor, Thorn." "On my honor," I said. They were the first words I had spoken in 3 hours, and they came out rough. Vell looked at me, then he turned and opened the door. The Hall of Hours is the great room of the Palace of Vered, a long bright stone hall with high windows down which the gray rain ran, and it was full. The whole court was there, standing in their ranks, the lords and the ladies and the officers, and at the far end on the dais sat the king, old King Aldemar in his green, with the Lord Marshal of the realm on his right hand and the keeper of the roll on his left, the great book open on its stand, the green ribbon laid ready across it. And before the dais, kneeling on the single step, his head bowed, his black half-cloak spread on the stone, was Sir Marius Calder, champion of the lists, in the moment before his name was to be set forever among the honored of the kingdom. The keeper of the roll had begun the words, that the crown of Vered, in recognition of valor and of honor borne worthily before the realm, does this day raise to the roll of the honored the name of Sir Marius. My king, I said it from the doorway, and the stone of the hall caught my voice and carried it the length of the room, and every head turned. I will not pretend I was not afraid. A sergeant of the guard bleeding out of place, his rifle in his hand, interrupting the king's own ceremony. There were men in that hall whose whole duty was to cut such a man down where he stood, and I felt them measure me. But there is an old law in Vered, and I had it by heart, and I spoke it before anyone could move. By the law of the assembled court, my king, the soldier's right of the hall, I am a sworn man of your guard, and I ask upon my honor to be heard before that name is set to the roll. The law gives me leave. I claim it. The hall did not breathe. King Aldemar was old, but he had been a soldier once, and his eyes were not old. He looked at me down the length of the hall a long moment, at the blood on my face and the broken post and the steadiness of me, and he knew, I think, the way old soldiers know, that no man does what I had done unless the thing in his hand is heavier than his life. The Lord Marshal leaned to the king and murmured, and I caught the word irregular, and another word mad, and the king lifted one hand a half-inch off the arm of the chair, and the marshal fell silent. The law is old, the king said, and his voice filled the hall without his seeming to raise it. But it is the law, and a king who will not hear his own soldier is no king I care to be. Come forward, sergeant. You are heard, but mark me. His eyes hardened. You stand on your honor in this. If you have come to break a good man's day for a grievance or for spite, there is no post low enough for you after, and no mercy in me. Speak, and speak true. I came up the length of the Hall of Hours with the whole court turning to watch me pass, and I stopped beside the kneeling man, and Calder lifted his head and looked up at me, and I watched the recognition come into his face at last. Not of me. Not yet, but of trouble, of a thing gone wrong on the one day of all days it must not, and I stood over him, bleeding from his whip, and I did the thing I had come 6 years and 20 to do. I did not accuse him. I will tell you that because it matters. I had imagined, across the years, 100 speeches, and in all of them I named him a murderer to his face before the king. But standing there, I found I did not need the speeches, and I did not want them because this was not about him. It had never truly been about him. So I reached under my tunic over my heart, and I drew out the small flat packet of oilcloth, worn soft as cloth itself with 20 years against my skin, and I unwound it with my hands, and inside was the letter yellowed, the ink faded but plain, the seal of the old garrison chaplain still on it, broken once, 20 years before, by a frightened boy. "My king," I said, and my voice was steady now, because the hard part, the holding, was over. 20 years ago, in a garrison of the eastern hills, a man was hanged for a murder he did not do. He was a quartermaster's clerk named Jonah Bray, an honest man, a nobody, who once saved my life when I was a sick boy he had no reason to save. He was hanged so that the man who did the murder might keep his honor and his future. Before he died, Jonah Bray wrote down the truth in his own hand and gave it to the chaplain, and the chaplain gave it to me, and I have carried it 20 years because I was too afraid, when it might have saved him, to bring it forward, and that is a shame I will carry to my grave whatever comes of this day. I held the letter out, not to Calder, but passed him to the king. I do not ask you to take my word, my king. I ask you only to read a dead man's. It is sworn and sealed by the chaplain who took it from his hand. It names the quarrel and the debt, and the weapon left in the alley, a black riding whip with a silver cap on the handle, that its owner swore had been stolen, the only such whip in the garrison, that its owner never went without before that night and never carried again. And it names the man. I lowered my eyes for the first time to the man kneeling at my feet. I make no accusation of my own. I bring you a dead man's letter, and the laws leave to bring it. Read it and judge, and let the roll wait the reading. The keeper of the roll came down from the dais and took the letter from my hand, and carried it to the king, and the king read it in the silence of the Hall of Hours with the rain running down the high windows, and I have never, before or since, heard a great room so still. I did not look at the king while he read. I looked at Sir Marius Calder, who had risen from his knees now slowly, and who was looking at the letter in the king's hands, the way a man looks at a thing coming for him out of deep water. I watched the legend go out of him. It is a strange thing to see. The carriage that had carried 20 years of being adored, the chin, the easy shoulders, the painter's angle, I watched it leave him by degrees as he understood what the letter was and whose hand had written it, and that it had existed, all this time, somewhere in the world, waiting. He did not bluster. I will give him that, or perhaps it was only that there was no bluster left to reach. He looked from the letter to me, and now, at last, he looked at me, truly looked, and I saw him search my older face for the boy who had carried the messages in a garrison 20 years gone, and I saw him find him, and I saw him understand that the tin soldier he had whipped for sport in the rain that morning was the one man in the kingdom who had been waiting, all his life, to be standing exactly here. He said, very quietly only to me, so that no one else heard it, I had forgotten his name. "I never did," I said. The king looked up from the letter. He looked at it a moment more, the old chaplain's seal, the dead man's hand, and then he closed it, and he set it gently on the great open roll of honor where the green ribbon lay, and he looked down at Sir Marius Calder, and the whole court saw the king's face, and knew. "The roll will not be added to today," King Aldemar said. His voice was very heavy. "Take the champion of the lists into the keeping of the marshal's men. The matter of the garrison of the eastern hills and the death of one Jonah Bray, quartermaster's clerk, is reopened by the crown of Vered, and will be tried before me, and tried true, however long the truth has waited and however high it reaches. And let the record show," and here the old king's eyes came up and found me, standing bloody beside the man, "that it was reopened upon the word of a dead nobody, brought forward by a sergeant of the salt gate who left his post to do it, and that the crown counts that not a breaking of the post but the keeping of it. The marshal's men came forward, and they took the whip from Calder's wrist. I watched them unloop it, and they led him from the hall of hours, and he went without a word, past the ranks of the court who had come to honor him and who now drew back from him as men draw back from a thing they have just learned the truth of, and the great doors closed behind him, and the green ribbon lay across the roll of honor with no name added under it. And a dead man's letter lay folded on the open page, where a champion's name should have gone. That is the whole of what happened in the Hall of Hours, and I have told it to you plain, because it does not need dressing. I would like to tell you that I felt some great thing in that moment, triumph, or peace, or the lifting of the 20-year weight off my heart. I did not. I felt only very tired and very old and aware of the sting of the whip on my face, and aware most of all that none of it brought Jonah Bray back, and that no king's court and no reopened trial could unhang a hanged man. The truth being heard at last did not undo the 20 years it had gone unheard. It could not. That is a thing I want you to understand, because it is the truest thing in this whole account, and the one the city left out when it made a tale of it after. Justice that comes too late is still justice, and a man should spend his life to bring it even so, but it is not the same as justice that comes in time, and anyone who tells you otherwise has never carried a letter 20 years against his heart. But the king gave Jonah Bray back his name. In the spring, when the matter had been tried and the truth of it set down, the crown of Vered struck the false judgment from the rolls of the eastern garrison, and entered in its place the truth, that Jonah Bray, quartermaster's clerk, had been wrongly condemned, and was held by the crown to have died an honest and an innocent man, and his name was read aloud in the garrison yard where they had hanged him, on a gray morning much like the one they took him, and I was there to hear it. A nobody's name, read out by a king's officer in a yard of soldiers standing at attention for a clerk. It is not much, it is not his life, but it is more than nothing, and I had given him nothing once. And I will take the more than nothing over the nothing for as long as I live. As for me, I went back to the salt gate. The king offered me a thing after, a posting at the grand gate, a place of honor. The Lord Marshal himself came down to tell me of it, a little stiffly, for he had called me mad in the king's hearing, and a man does not love to be proven wrong. I thanked him, and I asked to keep the salt gate, and they let me, and they did not understand why, and I did not explain it, the way I had never explained why I asked for it in the first place. I kept it 4 more years, until my knees were done and the cold finally won, and then I left the guard and came to where I am now, to write this down at last, an old man with a thin white scar under his eye that he has never once been sorry for. People who heard the story used to ask me, they would seek me out, some of them, and ask how I bore it. The whip, they meant. The standing there in the rain and taking it when I could have answered the first blow and been within my rights, when I could have struck the man down and let the truth come out in the brawl. How did I hold? They would ask, as though the holding were the marvel of the thing. But the holding was never the marvel. The holding was only the trade. A guardsman holds. That is the whole of him. I will tell you what I have come to believe instead, standing all those years at that cold gate with a dead man's letter over my heart. Anger is easy. Anger would have struck the first blow and felt grand doing it and lost everything, lost the day, lost the law, lost the one chance the king's old law gave me, lost Jonah Bray a second time, and made me the mad guardsman and Calder the wronged man, and buried the truth under the brawl forever. Anger is loud and it feels like strength, and it is the weakest thing there is, because it spends itself in a second and pays for nothing. Discipline is the slow thing. Discipline is standing in the rain and taking the whip across your face and giving the man nothing, not because you are a tin soldier and feel nothing, but because you feel everything, and you have somewhere you are carrying it, and you will not spill it in the dust for the price of 1 second's relief. Discipline is the long patience of a man who knows that the truth, kept and carried and brought at last to the one place and the 1 hour where it can be heard, is heavier than any blow he could ever strike. I held the post 20 years. I held my face 3 hours. I did it for a man who fed broth to a sick boy and asked nothing, and was hanged for it, and waited in a folded letter over my heart for the day his name could stand again. That was the longest watch I ever stood, and I never left it, not truly, not in 20 years. And the morning they read his name in the garrison yard, with the soldiers at attention for a clerk and the gray rain coming down the way it always seemed to come down on the days that mattered, I felt the watch end at last, and I came at last to attention myself, alone in the back of the crowd, an old guardsman saluting a dead man, and I thought, there, Jonah. I waited. I came. You are still here. And then I went home, out of the rain, and I have not stood a post since, because there was only ever the one I was standing for.